September 5th, 1862. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia has crossed the Potomac River into Maryland, launching its first invasion of the North. Fueled from the recent string of Southern victories at Cedar Mountain and Second Manassas just a month prior, Confederate morale is high in knowing that their Union adversaries have been severely weakened. Their destination is Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a vital communication and manufacturing center of the Federal war effort. Once in Pennsylvania, Confederate leaders plan to play up on Northern disaffection for the war. They plan to make a direct appeal to the Union people to end the fighting and sue the United States for peace. Southern soldiers on Union soil might also cause panic within the stock market, which would hopefully lead to international recognition of the Confederacy, and maybe even intervention from the European powers on their behalf. While unaware of the political ramifications, the average Southern soldier is aware of one thing just as important. Their side is winning, and one more victory might win it all.
Imagine a river about 500 yards wide, 2 to 3 feet deep, and very swift, as full of men as it could be, all apparently jolly. I imagine that some of them at least contemplated the serious side of the situation, while I was deeply impressed in the movement, yet I could not for the life of me suppress a feeling of sadness as I beheld the vast concourse of humanity wading the river, apparently never once thinking that their feet, many of them, would never again touch the soil on the south side of the Potomac. Private John Stevens, Hood's Texas Brigade.
The Union Army in September of 1862 had recently suffered its disastrous defeat during the Peninsular Campaign and had fallen back to the defenses of Washington. The Army of the Potomac, a collection of 3 Union armies thrown together in early September, was now led by General George B. McClellan, recently restored as overall Union commander. McClellan's restoral proved to be a morale booster to the Federal Army, creating tremendous and joyous uproar within the ranks. In 1862, McClellan was only 36 years old, younger than all of his subordinates. His popularity, however, within the ranks came from the pride he had instilled in them from their previous engagements through the Virginia Peninsula in May and June, which saw the Union forces methodically maneuver the Confederates back to their capital at Richmond, forcing it to capitulate. It was in this campaign that Robert E. Lee replaced Joseph E. Johnston as the commander of the Confederates' Army of Northern Virginia. At this crucial moment, Lee successfully rallied the shattered Southerners and routed the Federal Army from Richmond's doorstep. President Abraham Lincoln wished for a limited war, focusing on preserving the Union and keeping pre-war institutions intact. However, as Union defeats began to mount, he began to seek a new way to destroy the Confederacy: emancipation. However, emancipation at this point in time would seem as desperation, so Lincoln would spend the next few weeks for what has capsulated him: a Union victory in the East. Robert E. Lee's invasion plan leaves a large Federal garrison at Harper's Ferry, the small arsenal town made famous by the abolitionist John Brown. Expecting this force to have been withdrawn at the time of his invasion, Lee plans to capture the garrison. He sends half of his army back to the Potomac River under General Thomas "Stonewall" Jackson. On September 15th, Jackson's army laid siege to Harper's Ferry, leading to a quick surrender of the entire Federal garrison of some 13,000 men. Wishing to make an immediate return to Lee, Jackson leaves A.P. Hill's Light Division to secure Harper's Ferry through the evening. Lee dictated his complicated plan in a communique entitled Special Order 191. However, through a breakdown in communication, an extra copy of the order is prepared and subsequently lost. It is found wrapped around 2 cigars by 2 Union soldiers, who immediately report their findings to Army Command. McClellan now knows exactly where Lee's army is, and moves to crush part of it before it can be brought together. The Union Army collides with the Confederate Army's rear guard in the gaps of South Mountain on September 14th, resulting in an all-day battle which routed the Confederates, but cost the Union precious time. The Battle of South Mountain is a small but decisive Union victory. Though the Southerners fall back, this allows Lee time to find a battleground of his choosing. Lee's retreat from South Mountain brings him to the small rural town of Sharpsburg, a small hamlet situated between the Potomac River and a swift-flowing creek, the Antietam. The terrain was well suited for a Confederate defense, stretching for about 4 miles from the Potomac to the lower bridge across the Antietam Creek, including farmland, woodland, and an eroded farm lane. Properly utilized, this kind of terrain would help to balance the odds. In examining the presented situation, Lee successfully predicted that McClellan would not begin his attacks on September 15th or even the 16th. On the 15th, he blew an opportunity to crush Lee entirely, who only had an army of 15,000 at that time. After much debate and arguments, McClellan postponed his attack until the morning of September 17th. On the 16th, McClellan positioned the 1st Corps under Joseph Hooker and the 12th Corps under Joseph Mansfield across the Antietam on Lee's left flank, to which Lee responded by immediately bolstering this flank, including sending an entire battalion of artillery. His artillery positioned itself running north along the Hagerstown Pike and across from a little modest whitewashed church built by the Dunkers, a pacifist sect of German Baptists. Quite an ironic place for a battle to be fought. By the evening of September 16th, the differing strengths of both armies proved to be daunting. McClellan had more than 70,000 men and 300 artillery pieces to throw at Lee's lines. Now unified, Lee's army, however, had only an estimated 40,000 men, with some 200 artillery. He would rely heavily on his army's ability to shift troops to meet the Federal onslaught. Surrounded by 2 great armies, the citizens of Sharpsburg took shelter in their basements, with about 200 citizens fleeing the town entirely and sheltering themselves in a nearby cave to ride out the storm. McClellan's battle plan was a good one, at least on paper it was. It called for the immediate attacks with the corps of Hooker, Mansfield, and Edwin Sumner to strike at Lee's left flank. All the while, Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps would attack the Confederate right flank along the Rohrbach Bridge. Fitzjohn Porter's 5th Corps remained as the central reserve, ready to exploit any Federal breakthrough. Facing these assaults would be Stonewall Jackson on the Confederate left flank, and General James Longstreet on the right flank. Tomorrow would be Wednesday, September 17th, the beginning of the bloodiest single day in American history, as combined armies of nearly 110,000 men prepared for the slaughter.
It was a miserable night. There was a sense of impending doom. We knew, everyone knew, that 2 great armies of 80,000 men were lying there face to face, only waiting for dawn to begin the battle. Clara Barton, September 16th.
At around 5:30 a.m. on September 17th, right as the sun began to rise, the Union Army's 1st Corps under Joseph Hooker began its attack on the Confederate left flank, with John Gibbon's Iron Brigade leading the column forward. They collided with Stonewall Jackson's men in Miller's Cornfield. As the Federal lines of battle emerged from the brush, they received devastating fire from units of Lawton's Georgian Brigade awaiting them.
Commence fire! Fire!
An artillery duel suddenly erupted between the two sides. Heavy casualties began to mount on both sides, with Stephen Lee describing the duel as artillery hell. As the Union lines continued their assaults past the Cornfield, a Louisiana brigade reformed itself along the Hagerstown Pike. 2 Wisconsin regiments wheel about and engage them head-on. For a brief moment, these two forces are literally firing at each other, eyeball to eyeball. Gradually, the Southerners fell back. However, just as if it looked like the Union Corps would break through, John Bell Hood's division burst through the shattered Confederates. Mad as hornets from being interrupted from their first hot meal in days, Hood's men stabilized the Confederate lines, launching a ferocious counterattack straight into the Union forces. The Federals began to withdraw. In the struggle, the Texas Brigade became separated from the rest of Hood's division and pursued the Federals ferociously all the way back to Miller's Cornfield. The Texans attacked through the corn as Federal rifle fire from both front and flank poured in.
The regiment of its own notion, and on one accord, advanced, loading and firing at will, unmindful of the galling and deadly fire into its ranks. Colonel Philip Work, commanding the 1st Texas Infantry.
Attack and counterattack from both armies took place in almost every conceivable direction and in no recognizable time sequence. With men not being able to see even a few feet in front of them, the fight in Miller's cornfield soon became a tremendous free-for-all, with both sides wrestling one another for control of the cornfield. Throughout the fighting, the 1st Texas lost approximately 186 out of 226 men, a casualty rate of 83.2%, the largest amount of casualties of any regiment in the Civil War.
Fallen back to the southwest limit of the corn, we rallied upon our battle flags. Its bearers were all shot down, and we returned without them. Colonel Philip Work.
As the 1st Corps struggled to regain control of Miller's cornfield, the 12th Corps under Joseph Mansfield was sent in for its turn to attack. Just what Joseph Hooker needs. He rushes to the front, preparing to launch an attack with his newly combined forces. But a stray bullet hits him in his foot, and the loss of blood forces him to leave the fight. Around the same time, while leading his men forward through the East Woods, Mansfield is mortally wounded, the only man who understood Hooker's orders. With both corps commanders taken off the field, half of the Army of the Potomac is left without a leader, leading the left flank's assaults to eventually sputter out into ferocious firefights. The Confederates continue their tenuous hold on the Dunkard Church. In the fields adjacent to the church, Stephen Lee's battery is still in position, firing case shot into advancing Union soldiers and switching to canister when they get close. The stalemate was finally broken when George Greene's 2 Federal brigades charged through a gap in the Confederate lines. Flanking the defenders, Greene's men forced the rebels back through the corn, leaving the dead piled high. This advance forced Hood's division and portions of Stephen Lee's batteries to abandon their position along Dunkard Church Ridge. With the cornfield now secured, Greene's men continued their attack all the way to the Dunkard Church, before intense fire from the west woods caused them to halt and return fire. With Union forces now occupying the church and the surrounding ridge, there was a sudden lull in the conflict. Taking advantage of the diminished fighting, Greene called back for reinforcements and ammunition, hoping to hold his position for longer. At approximately 9 a.m., McClellan finally gave orders for the 2nd Corps under Edwin Sumner to cross the Antietam and to attack the Confederate left, reinforcing the 1st and 12th Corps. Leading them was John Sedgwick's division, who quickly formed 3 lines of battle and surged forward, leaving the other 2 divisions of Sumner's corps behind. Sedgwick's men pressed hard until they reached the Dunker Church, where Greene's men were still holding out. Sedgwick's 4,500-man division advanced beyond the safety of the church into the West Woods, where his first line encountered remnants of Stonewall Jackson's men. The 2 rear brigades of Sedgwick's line relaxed as a lively firefight erupted between the Confederates and the leading brigade. Suddenly, a reinforcing Confederate division under Lafayette McLaws arrived and surrounded Sedgwick's men in the West Woods. They opened fire with murderous effect and charged directly into the Federals' flank. In an estimated 20 minutes, nearly half of Sedgwick's men were added to the casualty list, with the rest in a complete rout.
Our regiment was practically annihilated. My men fell all around me like flies in a frosty morning. Lieutenant James Peacock, 59th New York.
Panic-stricken Union soldiers quickly fell back, running for their lives.
Dear parents, brothers, and sisters, I'm wounded. Mortally, I think. The fight rages around me. I've done my duty, and this is my consolation. I've left not the line until nearly all had fallen and colors gone. I'm weak. My arms are free. My chest, all is numb. The enemy trotting over me, but a numbness to my heart. Goodbye to all. Alan Zacharias, Company E, 7th Michigan Volunteers.
The battle began at 5:30 in the morning, but by 9 a.m., the Confederates have withstood the attacks of 3 separate Union corps and beaten all of them back. More than 12,000 men had been killed or wounded since the battle's beginning. That's 1 American every single second. And some of the worst fighting is yet to come. Immediately south of the Dunker Church was an old sunken farm lane, partially eroded by frequent use. It's an already made fortification, and the Confederates under Daniel Hill fully expect to use it. Approaching the Confederates in the Sunken Road are the rest of Sumner's 2nd Corps, 2 divisions under Generals William French and Israel Richardson. These troops have lost track of their lead division under Sedgwick, the one that McLaws had beaten in the West Woods. Mistaking some units of the 12th Corps as their own lead division, French and Richardson formed their lines of battle, wheel to the south, and advance into a whirlwind. Mostly concealed in the Sunken Road, D.H. Hill's Confederates waited and waited until the Federal lines just crested the hill, nearly 100 yards to their front. As French's 1st Union Brigade began to descend the hill, the Confederates finally emerged from the Sunken Road and opened fire, blasting the attacking line to utter pieces.
Fire!
My rifles flamed and roared in the Federals' faces like a blinding blaze of lightning, accompanied by the quick and deadly thunderbolt. The effect was appalling. The entire front line, with few exceptions, went down on the consuming blast. Colonel John B. Gordon, commanding 6th Alabama Volunteers.
As the first Union line of battle gradually melted away, the second topped the ridge and immediately came under fire. Eventually, all of French's division was sent into the fray, and the battle eventually settled into a slugfest, with both sides blazing away at one another from their positions. Exposed on the front side of the crest, the Federals take enormous casualties and fall back to the back side of the hill. One regiment, the 8th Ohio, halted just below the crest, kneeling under cover to reload, only exposing themselves when ready to fire.
The din is frightful. Our men are falling fast. We've seen a great deal of service before now, but our fighting's always been mostly of the sultry skirmishing sort. What we see now looks to us more like systematic killing. Sergeant Thomas Gowling, 8th Ohio Volunteers.
As French's division is fully engaged, the last division of Sumner's corps under Richardson is sent forward to reinforce French and join the attack. Leading Richardson's division on French's left is the famous Irish Brigade, who, just like French, attempted a costly frontal assault into the Confederate positions. With both of Sumner's remaining divisions now engaged, the fighting became general all along the Sunken Road. For 2 hours, the killing continued as the dead and wounded on both sides piled up. Gradually, however, the weight of Union numbers began to tell, and the Confederate line began to waver. Richardson's division, led by a handful of Delaware regiments, eventually flanked around the Confederate right into the Sunken Road, proceeding to fire directly down the lane, transforming the ditch into a death trap. Through high casualties and a misunderstood order, the Confederate line collapsed like a dam, and the Union troops launched a bayonet charge into the gaps in the road, finishing off any survivors. Virtually all of the Confederate defenders who weren't killed fell back. More than 5,600 men lay dead or wounded in and around the Sunken Road, which would hereafter be known as the Bloody Lane. At the Piper farm just beyond the Sunken Road, Daniel Hill tries to rally his shattered division. With a scratch force of some 200 men, Hill personally leads a forlorn hope back toward the Sunken Road, with a series of counterattacks and ambushes from Confederate survivors. Union forces there beat him back with ease. Meanwhile, General James Longstreet was trying to rally every single artillery piece he could find. The ensuing artillery barrage from the Piper Farm, combined with D.H. Hill's stubborn attacks, eventually halted the Union advance beyond the Sunken Road. While seeking to counteract Longstreet's guns, General Richardson was mortally wounded by an exploding shell, and the Federal momentum was lost on this part of the field. George McClellan had yet another opportunity to crush Lee. He had 23,000 fresh troops within easy marching distance of the Sunken Road, as well as Alfred Pleasonton's 3,500 cavalry. All that stood between his army and Sharpsburg were Longstreet's cannons and a number of disorganized Confederate regiments. But McClellan's extreme caution prevented him from acting decisively. Perhaps the fierceness of the Confederate defenders had intimidated him. Robert E. Lee had gambled everything, but McClellan would risk nothing. The attacks on the Confederate left and center eventually sputtered out and ended as the fighting moved south again. Sometime after 10 a.m., Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps finally got its attacks over the Rohrbach Bridge underway. Burnside knew his role to be diversionary, however, and thus launched a series of uncoordinated small-scale assaults with one brigade after another over the narrow, 12-foot-wide bridge, which would hereafter be known as Burnside's Bridge. The Confederates occupied a strong defensive position on the high bluffs opposite the bridge. Though they numbered only an estimated 600 men, the strength of their positioning more than made up for the disparity in numbers. Burnside's half-hearted attempts to cross the bridge only resulted in more casualties. Hours passed with no progress being made against the heavily outnumbered Confederates. One regiment, the 11th Connecticut, under Captain John Griswold, attempted a hopeless assault fording the creek south of the bridge. As more and more reinforcing brigades were rushed to the bridge along a trail parallel to the creek, Confederate soldiers opened fire into the ranks of the now exposed lines. One Confederate soldier compared the columns to targets in a shooting gallery. Finally, the order went out to the 51st New York and the 51st Pennsylvania under Colonel Edward Ferrero. Ferrero promised to return the two regiments' whiskey rations if they took the bridge. Sensing an opportunity, and without orders from their officers, the two regiments packed themselves into tight columns and raced across the bridge with the colors in the lead. When the bridge was finally taken after 3 hours of fighting, hundreds of Federals, including Griswold and other members of his unit, were left floating down the creek. With Burnside's bridge now secured, the Confederate defenders under Robert Toombs knew that it was now the time to retreat. Low on ammunition, and informed that a portion of Burnside's corps had earlier crossed the Antietam at Snavely's Ford, they withdrew. Burnside's corps did not immediately exploit their advantage, instead taking up another 3 delayed hours to gather their forces across the creek and reform. Though virtually no stable Confederate force stood between them and the city of Sharpsburg, fresh Union troops were brought to the front to replace the tired and wounded. Lee had no reserves left. He had committed all of his troops, all of which were exhausted after some of the most brutal fighting they had seen all day. Unit organizations were utterly destroyed, and the regiments that were left to face Burnside's upcoming attack were small. Despite this, many Confederates under Robert Toombs decided to make a hold around the Otto and Sherrick farms. Burnside had rallied 8,000 troops, backed by 22 cannon, to make the last grand assault towards Sharpsburg. The Confederates surrounding the farm fought ferociously to the death, as they had done already, stubbornly falling back as they held to their best ability. They could not hope to hold for long against such odds, however, and the Federals pushed on from the Otto and Sherrick farms closer to the outskirts of Sharpsburg. But then, momentum shifted. At approximately 3:30 p.m., troops emerged from the southern end of the battlefield. A.P. Hill's Light Division had finally arrived from Harper's Ferry and was in perfect position to rescue Lee's right flank. Although Hill had only 3,000 men left in his ranks after a grueling 17-mile march that lasted 8 hours, they quickly filed into line and threw themselves into the advancing Federals. Caught by utter surprise, Burnside's attack disintegrated, and the Union troops fell back to the bridge. Lee had held, in spite of incredible odds stacked against him. His men had fought like demons, and McClellan had failed in launching his attacks with his superior numbers. More than 30,000 Union soldiers never took part in the fighting, and were held back in reserve for an expected counterattack that never came. As the sun set, the battle slowly tapered off into the occasional skirmishing and picket fire. After 11 hours of savage fighting, the Battle of Antietam was finally over. More than 23,000 men were either killed or wounded. 9 Confederate officers and 9 Federal officers had fallen. It had been the bloodiest single day in American military history. It was a day that would live on in the memories and in the nightmares of those who took part for years to come. On September 18th, the two armies arranged a ceasefire to tend for the thousands of dead and wounded scattered throughout their field of battle, with many men uniting with their enemies.
It seemed very curious to see the men of both sides come together and talk to each other when the day before we were firing at each other. Kelvin Leach, Private, 4th North Carolina.
Among the witnesses to the truce on the 18th, Alexander Gardner and his assistant James Gibson. These two men were employed by Matthew Brady, who operated photographic galleries in Washington and New York. What they would capture would change the way that the public would think of warfare forever. Throughout the campaign and the battle, Robert E. Lee has been outnumbered at least 2-1, and on September 18th, the disparity is unchanged. But since Lee's army remains through the 18th, McClellan suspects that he has good reason to ready his army to continue the attacks on the next day. But during that evening, Lee's army secretly crosses the Potomac River back into Virginia, and the campaign, which held so much promise for the Confederacy, was over. The Battle of Antietam was a draw. However, with the Confederate army back in Virginia, it is a victory enough for the Union Army, and for Abraham Lincoln specifically. For McClellan, however, he was satisfied with the victory that he felt he had so rightfully won. Despite the immediate availability of 30,000 fresh troops, he chose not to pursue Lee's army back into Virginia. President Lincoln was furious and demanded McClellan advance and destroy Lee's army. But McClellan refused, protesting that his men and horses were fatigued. The next day, Lincoln made a personal visit to the Sharpsburg battlefield to see for himself. For failing to pursue Lee, Lincoln personally removed McClellan for the last time as overall commander of the Union Army of the Potomac. President Lincoln also takes advantage of the closest thing he considered a Union victory to make an unseen political maneuver. On September 22, 1862, just 5 days after the battle, Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation, setting all slaves held in Southern states free. This gesture officially made the war against the institution of slavery, which the European powers were unlikely to fight to defend. Thus, with the stroke of a pen, Lincoln ended the risk of European intervention, recognition of the Confederacy, and gave the Union Army a new cause to fight for. Ten months later, in June of 1863, men of the Army of Northern Virginia find themselves on familiar ground. Robert E. Lee's army is on the move again for its second invasion of the North, and the rout of some portions of his troops placed them back on the old Antietam battlefield, where they had fought just a year before.
Dear father, mother, and family, I have been this morning over the old Sharpsburg battlefield, and have witnessed the most horrible sights that my eyes ever beheld. I saw the dead in any number, just lying on top of the ground, their bones bleaching, and they by the many hundreds. Oh, what a horrible sight for human beings to look upon. God grant that the time may speedily come, that peace may return to our once happy country, and our lives be spared to meet each other again on this earth. George Harlow, Private, Company D, 23rd Virginia.
As the 23rd Virginia reached the intersection of the Hagerstown Pike in front of the now battered Dunkard Church, they turned right, north, toward Harrisburg and the road to Pennsylvania. Once more, the Army's goal is Harrisburg, but once again, Lee will fail to reach the Susquehanna River. Instead, just 2 weeks later, on July 1st, he'll fight the Army of the Potomac again in another small farming community, at a town called Gettysburg.